There are moments when you look back and realize you begged God for something that didn't last. You remember how quiet it was when you asked. Not dramatic, not desperate, just honest. You waited. You prayed. You believed this was the start of something you would finally get to keep. You didn't ask for too much. You just didn't know the full story yet. There was hope in your voice when you prayed, a softness in your heart, a certainty that if you held on a little longer, it would make sense. You weren't wrong for believing. You were human. You imagined beginnings, new habits, new memories, a future that felt warm and possible. And when it ended, you didn't just lose a person or a plan. You lost the version of the future you had already started living inside. That's what hurt the most. Not the ending itself, but the confusion. The quiet question you never said out loud. God, why would you let me believe in this? This may be one of those seasons where God saw the ending while you were still praying for the beginning. And maybe the story didn't stop there. Before we discuss why it ended, we need to understand why it felt so right in the first place. You didn't pray for the wrong thing because you were foolish. You prayed because, in the beginning, it felt right in a way that was hard to explain. Not dramatic, not reckless, just quietly convincing. There was warmth where there had been emptiness, possibility where there had been waiting. And for the first time in a while, your heart felt hopeful instead of guarded. You prayed because you believed this could become something good. That belief didn't come from fantasy. It came from sincerity. You weren't chasing chaos or trying to fill a void. You weren't ignoring the truth on purpose. You were responding to the connection, to effort, to moments that felt genuine. You saw kindness. You saw potential. You saw a future that might grow if you were patient enough. And patience felt noble. Staying felt mature. Enduring felt like love. Hope doesn't feel dangerous until it asks you to stay too long. At first, staying felt like a commitment, like faith, like choosing depth over fear. You told yourself that beginnings are fragile, that real connection needs time, that walking away too early would mean you didn't fight hard enough for what mattered. So, you stayed. Not because you were weak, but because you were hopeful. You explained what hurt instead of naming it. You softened your needs instead of honoring them. You made space for discomfort because you believed growth always comes with sacrifice. And slowly, almost invisibly, you began carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. There's a line in Scripture that many people hear long before they understand it. Above all else, guard your heart, not as a warning, as wisdom that only makes sense after something has already cost you. Love didn't break you in one moment. It wore you down quietly. The beginning wasn't cruel. That's what made it confusing. It wasn't obviously unsafe. It just kept asking for more patience, more understanding, more of you, until you forgot what safety was supposed to feel like. That doesn't make you naive. It makes you human. But before we talk about why it ended, we have to look at what the beginning was slowly taking from you, and why that matters more than you realized. Some endings only make sense after they've already hurt. At first, the loss feels unbearable, not just because something ended, but because your heart keeps reaching back, trying to understand why. You replay conversations. You revisit prayers. You search for the moment where things could have gone differently, hoping clarity might undo the pain. What once felt like confusion slowly becomes clarity, not in a sudden revelation, not in relief, but in small, honest moments. In the way your body exhales now that it doesn't have to brace itself anymore. In the silence that no longer feels heavy, but honest. In the realization that you're not shrinking, explaining, or waiting in the same way you used to. You don't wake up grateful. You wake up aware. Aware of how much effort it took to keep things together. And aware of how much you were carrying alone. Aware of how normal it felt to live without peace. Not everything ends because it failed. Some things end because they've finished forming you. Because the version of you who entered that beginning is not the version that could survive staying. Because what felt like loss was also release. From tension you normalized, from emotional weight you learned to carry, from a future that quietly asked for too much of you. And that's when the questions begin to change, not disappear, but soften. You stop asking what you did wrong. You start noticing what you no longer have to endure. There's a verse that sounds different after loss. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. Not as an answer, as a presence, not explaining the pain, just staying near while it aches. And somehow, that nearness reframes the ending. Not as punishment, not as rejection, but as something that held you when you couldn't hold yourself. Something that saw the weight before you named it. Something that stayed when everything else fell quiet. Understanding doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as recognition. You begin to see what the beginning asked of you, what the middle required you to sacrifice, what the ending returned slowly, gently over time. And before you can fully understand what was taken away, another truth begins to surface. Because the loss wasn't only about what ended. It was also about what was seen, long before you were ready to see it yourself. God didn't stop you from loving. He protected you from what love would have cost you. At the time, it felt like rejection, like being turned away from something you were finally ready for. You questioned yourself, your timing, your judgment, your worth. You wondered why something that felt so real could end without explanation. What you saw as the beginning, God saw as a limit. Not because your heart was wrong, not because your desire was misplaced, but because there were edges you couldn't see yet. Places where staying would slowly ask you to bend, to quiet parts of yourself, to normalize weight you were never meant to carry. You didn't see that future. You only saw the possibility. And possibility can feel holy when you're hopeful. God saw the ending before you learned what staying would take from you. When He saw the nights you would overthink your needs, the moments you would second-guess your voice, the strength you would keep giving without being replenished. He saw how love, if left unchecked, can quietly become endurance instead of safety. This wasn't controlled. It was preservation. There's a verse that many people skim past until life slows them down enough to hear it. The Lord watches over you, not directing every step, not forcing every outcome, just watching, staying close, guarding what matters when you can't yet tell what it will cost. God didn't rush you out. He stayed until the season revealed itself. He stayed while you tried to make sense of mixed signals. Stayed while you hoped things would soften. Stayed while you learned, through experience, not instruction, what your heart could and could not survive. And when it ended, it didn't mean you were unwanted. It meant you were protected. What felt like loss was actually coverage. Coverage over your peace. coverage over your identity, coverage over the future version of you who needed more space to grow than that love could offer. This is where the shift happens, not from sadness to joy, but from shame to understanding. You weren't rejected. You were spared from becoming smaller. You were kept from a future that would have asked you to disappear in pieces. And now, with a little distance, another truth begins to surface. Because what God protected wasn't just your heart. It was who you were becoming next. Maybe the pain wasn't the mistake. Maybe believing it had no meaning was. What hurt you wasn't loving deeply. What hurt you was thinking it all led nowhere. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't exaggerate the hope. You didn't fail for believing something good could grow there. The pain was real because the heart you brought was real. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Not every chapter exists to stay forever. Some chapters exist to reveal who you are when you love honestly. Some endings aren't meant to be understood immediately, only honored for what they protected. You weren't weak for caring. You were brave enough to feel. And the moment you stop calling that a flaw, something shifts inside you. The shame loosens. The self-blame quiets. The story softens. You begin to realize that loss doesn't always mean something was wrong. Sometimes it means something was watching over you. This isn't about rushing healing or forcing meaning. It's about letting the experience change you without letting it harden you. It's about trusting that what didn't stay still mattered, and what mattered still shaped you. If this feels close to your story, you don't need to explain it. You don't need to justify it. You can write one quiet sentence in the comments. God saw what I didn't. This channel is for those learning not to rush healing, not to ignore the quiet lessons, and not to dismiss what God gently reveals over time. If you felt seen here, you're welcome to stay. You can like this video, share it with someone who's still healing, and subscribe. Not because you have to, but because this space is meant to feel like company, not pressure. And remember this: nothing you felt was wasted. Nothing you loved was invisible. And nothing you're becoming is accidental.